Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Risk Less, Achieve More, Integrating Risk Management into Project Success. Today's event is part of our monthly webinar series. You can find information about future sessions wherever you found this one. We ask that you hold your questions until the end, but feel free to type them into the chat or question window so you don't forget. Today's speaker is Sylvie Edwards. Sylvie is a project management expert with 25 years of experience across various industries. She has led projects at a top 5 consulting firm in IT, banking, health, government, and security. Sylvie was instrumental in the development of methodologies for the creation of project management offices and has worked on the establishment of a project maturity model for both practitioner and organization. With over 12 years on the PMI board, including 2 terms as president, she's a leader in education and mentoring. Welcome, Sylvie.
Hello everybody. So I hope that you're having a good time. The weather wherever you are is treating you good. Here in Toronto, it's pretty darn hot, and it's going to be that way for a couple more days or weeks. So let's get started. So risk is sort of the one of the areas that I love and that I have fun doing and working in or teaching to some of the students. So I hope you're going to enjoy this presentation. A couple of things that I would like to try to get us to get from today's session. The first thing, I'm going to talk about some of key elements or like basic elements that you need to kind of think of when you're setting up or if you want to upgrade or update your like risk management practices on projects, so that you're like become more successful. Sometimes it's just the tweaking, and we're going to talk about that. The second thing is literally looking at some basic foundation items that you should always have in everything around risk management for your organization or your projects, portfolio programs, wherever level you're looking at. We're going to talk about some key ones. We're also going to talk about and discuss the importance of having best practices, like things that everybody knows, things that everybody is trained on, and that becomes like at the core of how we do the work. And then finally, I'm going to kind of draw a little bit on some lessons learned that I've gathered over the years with some key points that might become lessons learned for you. Oops, went a little bit too fast on the clicker. So a little bit of an agenda. So I'm going to start, I always like to start with definitions. We're going to start with that. We're going to talk a little bit about the why, then the elements for success, foundational, basic, best practice, lessons learned, and the final last words. So definitions. I always like to start with definitions because it literally puts you in the context, and it makes sure that everybody's got the same baseline when looking at what we're going to discuss. So needless to say, when you're looking at risk, there are a whole lot of definitions. I try whenever possible to stay within the context that we're looking at, i.e. projects, program, portfolio. So here are some of the ones that I've gotten. The one that you'll see that is a little bit different is the main Oxford Dictionary definition. It talks about loss, injury, or other adverse or unwelcome circumstances. That also, if I had put in here the description or the definition from a Canadian insurance board, for example, you would see like a different slant on the definition. When it comes to us, if you look at the PMI one there at the bottom right, an uncertain event or condition that if it occurs as a positive or negative effect on project objective, this is basically what we are trying to aim for when we're working with risk management on our projects. We're trying to define what uncertainty means and define it in a way that we can literally see what the impacts to our projects are going to be. So either positive or negative. And I'm going to talk about the positive versus the negative a little bit more. Just because over the years, I have had a lot of clients or I've had students or people ask me, Sylvie, what would be your definition of risk? And I came up with the one there at the bottom left. A risk is something that might happen. So a risk is never a given. And that's for what we're doing risk management for, actually, is because we want to try to lessen the probability of happening or the impact. And that impact could be like positive or negative to our project. So again, that positive and negative is on there. There's a bunch of different, so for ISO has got a standard around this. There's a bunch of different standards out there that all have like different definitions, different level, different depth of definitions. It's always important to kind of figure out and to be able to explain it to your stakeholders. A lot of time you're going to be working with people and you need to get them to understand, what are we kind of looking at? What are we going to be doing? And it often starts with the definition. The thing about risk, and if somebody can tell me differently, I would like to hear your opinion somehow over coffee, but all projects that I have been involved, that I have seen people be involved in, always have some level of risk. Some of them, yeah, it's like minor. Some of them it's larger. I don't find that it's has to do with the size of the complexity of the project. Sometimes it does. But if you're thinking, for example, of a project that you've done before and that you're repeating or you're doing something similar, there's more awareness around risk. So it might appear that the risk is less when in fact the risk is probably the same. It's just that you've encountered it before. So there's literally no projects that I know of that don't have a certain element of risk. And actually, I can probably contend that if the project had no risk at all, people would not actually be tempted to do it. It's kind of like a risk is like the gamble, like the gamble that you take when you're about to do something. And for me, when I look at the definition of a project, the definition itself says, hey, you're going to have risk. So first part of the definition for a project is that it is a temporary endeavor. So temporary means as a beginning, as an end. Are we going to meet that end? Are we going to be on time? Is it going to start? Is it going to complete? So temporary is the first part. The second part of the definition refers to the results being unique for either product, service, or what we're doing as part of the project deliverables. And the uniqueness, i.e. not the same as before or slightly different than before or totally different than before, brings on a certain level of risk, or like the thought process around it, like makes you think of risk. Every project, although it's not part of the definition, it is part of the reality. Every project that you're doing will bring about change. So change, i.e. we're going to get a new something, we're going to change the way we're doing things. It can literally be a project that will totally change the organization. It could be a project that will slightly change something for someone. I like to kind of joke around with people that as a project manager, when you walk into the room, you have the word like change, like a billboard on your head, and people go, uh-oh, our life is about to change, because projects will involve like a certain degree or level of change. The other part of a definition of a project that to me equals uncertainty is the fact that projects are progressively elaborated, i.e. we don't come up with the perfect plan, the full plan, totally vetted out right on the first day. It kind of goes and gets progressively elaborated over time. A good example of that is like totally relevant to risk are your schedule and your budget. So your schedule you'll have a straw kind of skeleton of it, and as the project progresses, it kind of firms up estimates over time. For estimates are actually a really good example. Estimates have a viability in a period of time. So if you're looking at kind of planning something, for example, at the charter level, your estimates should be completed by or should not exceed a certain level. As you're going into planning, that's when you start dwindling down and solidifying those times and those budget amounts. And that's what progressively is elaborated comes up or comes out of. And uncertainty is attached to that. And uncertainty basically equals risk, right? So if we don't know if we are going to meet a deadline, or if we don't know if a vendor is going to be able to supply us with something at a certain price, that it becomes clearer over time, but it's also something that will create uncertainty. I would also contend that risk is present in all of our lives at a number of different levels and different things that we do every day. It's actually kind of universal. The only problem is as humans in general, we have bizarre reaction to risk sometimes. And we're going to talk more about risk acceptance and risk tolerance as we're going later in the presentation. But a lot of time, because of that, people have a difficulty like talking about risk and literally doing something because they don't want risk to happen. It's not by doing something that you make it happen. And we're going to talk about that. So key elements for success. So I kind of, over the years and over time, kind of looked at 6 elements that if you are really thoughtful about when you're planning, about when you're putting your documentation, putting your framework, putting your structure around risk for, if you think of these 6 components, you should actually kind of nudge the success bar a little bit. And it starts with the first one is this will not happen if the organization is not committed to it. So if you have people in your organization, and I've been told this several times, oh, that's a waste of time. It's just like paperwork and nothing happens. So if that happens in your organization, then your risk management efforts are going to be way less successful because you're going to need to spend your time working on convincing people as opposed to working on trying to like be one step ahead of risk. The second one is recognizing that risk management has value. The one thing I have to say about that, a lot of people find that it's just something that we do to protect ourselves, and then sometimes the value or the concept of value or creating or generating value is not really something that people think of. I will contend that for most people, if this is how your organization sees it, is that you haven't really been working a lot at trying to take advantage of opportunities. I find that if in an organization, people start not only protecting themselves against negative risk, but taking advantage of opportunities that come up in the discussion around risk, that's when people start seeing the value of risk management. And I can't highlight this enough. Like I have had some people that I've worked with that could not understand the concept that risk might be an opportunity, and not that risk is not just a bad thing that we're trying to save ourselves from. As soon as that mentality shifts, then that's when you see that people are able to recognize, hey, what if we did this? And you become much more strategic, and the value becomes much more visible to folks. The third thing, and we're going to talk in a couple of seconds about like having a framework. Framework and a process and everything can be really cumbersome. I will kind of give you some of the best kind of basic stuff. Start basic and then build from there. If your organization does not do anything around risk, don't start with the full-on risk quantification and models and software. Just start basic and kind of go from there. And literally, the one other thing that you need to think of is every project will be different. So you need to make sure that you scale your risk efforts to the size, complexity, and components of your project. so that you might have like a basic framework, but then you adjust it for a small, medium, large, complex, whatever it may be, and that you try to keep doing this so that people don't think, for example, on the 3 months project that they don't need to do risk management. They still need to do it. They're probably going to use the same framework or the same documentation, but at a very much less effort. So you need to scale or kind of tailor the risk effort to the project. Whoops, I went one extra, sorry about that, but we'll talk about open and honest communication first. I cannot stress this enough. I've actually had a CEO of a company call me into his office before I was starting to do work for them saying, I don't want you to use the word risk while you're here doing this work. And I went, okay, so what do you want me to use? So you need to be open, transparent, and you need to get people involved. Which is the next one from an individual's perspective, but it starts with the communication. You need to call a risk a risk. You need to have discussions and brainstorming, and like the more heads around this, the better. And with open and honest communication, people will know. People will see stuff and they can report back. People will feel more involved, and that's like really important for making sure that your risk management efforts are really supported. If everything is done behind a closed door, there's also this kind of like paranoia thing that happens. Oh, it must be bad. Well, no, it doesn't need to be bad. It needs to be discussed. A risk is a risk, right? It's not an issue or it's not a problem, it's a risk. And a risk may, like my definition before, might happen. Not necessarily that we have it on the risk register, that it will happen. And that's the whole point of the communication. Making sure, the next one, that you have people that understand what is their responsibility, what's their commitment, how to get them involved and engaged. And again, more than one or two heads are better. And also in an organization, what you need to think of is the PM and the team cannot be everywhere looking at things or being aware of things. So the more people at different levels that you have working with you, the better it will filter back into your communication, and the more proactive and the more awareness you're going to have. And the last part is, a lot of people see risk management as a process that you do, and you do this and you do that and you do this and you do that, without necessarily thinking that it is really truly integrated with all of the other processes and all of the other work that you do as part of your project management. So if you talk about scope, then yes, risk and scope are a thing. Time and scope are a thing. Resource and scope are a thing. Communication is a thing. Stakeholders is a thing. So it's all integrated. So it shouldn't be like an afterthought. It should kind of be part of the overall process. And you want to make sure that people understand, so that if there's something that gets triggered over here, how it might have an impact on the rest of the whole thing. And those are kind of 6 really key elements that you would see if you start really kind of thinking on how to make these work. You'll be like further along and further ahead in your risk management efforts. Okay. Oh, I keep on skipping a slide, so let's go back. So what is a foundational basic for me? Basically something that is essential that you put in place to help you go and not start from zero all the time. So let's have a look at a couple things that I think are foundational for risk management. And here I go again. So a solid framework. Framing the work. So basically, it's having a structured methodology, usually kind of represented in a flow chart, where you will be able to literally have people look at this and say, here's what we do and here's kind of how we do it. How are we going to identify the risk, address, assess? How are we going to respond to risk? So the whole integrated process and view of how we're going to do risk management for projects or for the organization. It often translates into enterprise risk management in other areas. So having a solid framework is really important. Most of the frameworks that you'll see out there are based or derived from standards like ISO. We'll see a little bit more about PMI, but there's different frameworks and standards, frameworks that come or are derived from standards. It's not really rare when I start doing work in an organization that doesn't really have anything defined or has too many kind of different ones all over the place to consolidate and create one framework for the organization. Frameworks can be fairly simple. So like the one on the left here is literally as basic could come. But for some organization and some people, this is like perfectly fine. It gives you all the right stuff. It shows you that with the arrows and the flows that this is to be repeated over and over and over and over again until you're done. Or it could be on the right side and a little bit more complex. So again, don't start with a 11 by 17 size framework where people have to turn it around 28,000 times to really understand what they're going to be doing. You can start basic and you can add on and layer things on as people feel very comfortable working with one framework and over time. So for example, in the one on the left, the approach is defined. The plan is set up. Well, you can actually have a document that would talk to you about the framework and go into more of the detail, but keep your representation and keep it kind of simply simple. Just because you really don't want to have people kind of literally be puzzled by what you're trying to do. Want to try to keep it simple. And again, if you go do a search on Google for risk management framework, there are thousands of permutations, some of them very simplistic. You need to be really careful because it does need to really truly represent what you're going to do and not just have big, I see quite often these circular ones with 4 things with not a lot of detail around it. You're going to need to make sure that people are able to understand it and that it's detailed enough but not overly complex. I've seen some that are actually way more complex than the one here on the right side. I just didn't want to overwhelm you with the complexity, but there are some people that go extensive on these things. You need to remember at the end of the day, what do you want your stakeholders and your users to be able to get from this? Can they have a look at this and say, oh, I get it, as opposed to you having to have an entire day session and training to kind of get them accustomed to it. PMI. So PMI is considered a standard, and PMI has different levels of addressing risk or uncertainty throughout the PMBOK guide and throughout different versions. So the version 7, which is kind of the current one, has kind of 2 layers. So as a principle first, so that around risk, where we want to make sure that we optimize our risk responses. That's kind of one layer. The next layer, it has a performance domain known as uncertainty, where the activities, the function associated with dealing with risk and uncertainty are going to be performed. And these are still based on the version 6, which is now part of the guiding the principle for the practice for process groups. So you'll find these 6 processes. This is what I still use in my head and when I teach folks, because it's sort of this could be as basic or as involved as your organization wants it to be, and actually encompasses like everything. So you have in here, you have 5 planning processes. Yes, planning of risk is the major load of work that you're doing. And then, yes, you have execution and the monitoring and control process where you're monitoring. So back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We said this was going to be the risk. This is actually the risk. This is what we're doing to deal or to take care of it, minimize or maximize impact or probability. Here's what happened. Did it work? Did it not work? Back and forth is going to kind of happen throughout the entire time that you're going to be doing your project. In terms of planning, yes, you need, and we're going to talk about some of the elements around that, around some of the basic best practices, but you need to start with a plan. So for this, and again, this is where the tailoring is going to come in. So for this particular project, what are we doing and not doing in terms of risk management, and who's doing it? So all that kind of information. Identifying risk to me is one of the major processes. Literally sitting down, having brainstorming sessions, talking to your stakeholders, talking to your subject matter experts, and understanding what the risk for this project may potentially be. Then you have performing qualitative, so qualifying the risk, and we're going to see how that happens through the stakeholder, the risk register. And then some organizations go full on quantitative, and quantitative means evaluating the risk. So the impact in terms of monetary impact or time impact. That's what quantitative is. There are some organizations that don't go that far into that process. And again, it depends how comfortable, what are the resources that you have, the subject matter expertise to be able to do that. For me, crushing numbers just for the sake of crushing numbers is not necessarily effective if you don't have the means of doing something, or if it's not improving what you're doing. And then the final planning process here is literally coming up with response. That's where we become proactive around risk. So we said there was potentially going to be this risk, or this negative risk, or this opportunity. So we analyzed it, and then we come up with what are we going to do to ensure that we increase the probability if it's an opportunity, or diminish the probability and the impact if it's a negative threat. And literally, those are it in terms of processes from a PMI perspective. Having a strategy that links what you're going to do to how you're going to do it is literally important. So in terms of our organization, how far will we go into analysis? What are we doing? How do we, one of my favorite saying is like, how sure are you sure that your numbers are sure? So how do we make sure that our analysis gives us the tools to be able to do risk management and to be good at it? The whole point of doing risk management is to be proactive. If you can't be proactive and you're just doing analysis and crunching of numbers and putting stuff on a document that is not being used effectively, then what's the point? You may as well not do it. You need to start basic. You need to start and then kind of having the framework, having the processes, having all that stuff, and then build on that. As people feel more comfortable, that you increase and you improve your communication, all the stuff is going to start kind of working into itself. And the last phrase that I put on there is please be patient. Rome was not built in a day. So if you are simply or just introducing this in your organization, don't jump into the Cadillac model and the full-on like enterprise risk management. Everybody's going to follow this. Everybody's going to, you're going to have people believe that this is just like kind of stuff to make their lives miserable, while that's totally the opposite intent from risk. So you need to be careful. Start with a solid basis, and then kind of move from there and review it once in a while. Is it working? Is it not working? And that's kind of part of having that strategy around how you're going to do risk management for your project. The next section, I want to talk about some of the best practices, literally procedures, techniques, processes, things to have so that you can end up with the better results at the end of the day. So you don't necessarily, and again, these things could be tweaked, these things could be changed, these things could be improved over time. And that's kind of basically what you're looking at with some of the best practices. The first one, communications. I cannot say enough. You need to call risk a risk. You need to go to your stakeholders, talk to them about risk, be open, transparent. You need to have visible, open communication, and often, not kind of have a whole onslaught of things in planning, then they don't hear from you until like something's gone wrong. And yes, that will make people scared of risk. So if it's a consistent monitoring, talking, discussion, feedback, if it's open as well, people are more likely to get more engaged, to be willing to share kind of their perspective, their perception on things, and it makes your entire risk management process way better. Communication, best practice number one. Best practice number two, having a comprehensive risk management plan. And some people will say, oh, you project managers, you like your documentation. Yes, but in the case of your project, a good risk management plan tailored to your project will tell them, hey, what are we doing for this project? So methodology wise, what approach, how are we using the framework? What are we doing, not doing? What tools are we using? How are we going to deal with data? Roles and responsibility for risk. So it's not like the roles and responsibility or the RACI chart that you would find for your entire project is specifically towards who's dealing with risk. Budgeting and timing. Are we going to need a special consideration in terms of money or time for doing risk management work? And that kind of links into your schedule, links into your budget, and it makes it so that you don't forget the little bits. Don't have time to go into too much around risk categories or risk breakdown structure, but it's like a representation of the types of risk or the categories of risk that might be in your project. Most organizations will keep a catalog of those so that it could kind of be reused from project to project. A really good thing to kind of keep in mind. Definitions, this is not like definitions like I showed you before. It's literally, how do we define probabilities and impact for this particular project? So we're going to talk in a second about using matrices and colors and labels and all that kind of stuff and numbers. So how do we define that? So what's the impact scale? What's the probability scale? What does it look like? How does it become our probability and impact matrix, and later on our heat map, where we're going to show people what the risk looks like for our project? So what does that look like? And making sure that it is explained so that people can see it and go, oh, okay, I get it. What are the thresholds? All that kind of information. Do you have an understanding of your stakeholder tolerances? We're going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but kind of documenting, is this like perceived to be like a high level risk project, and is it because we've never done it before? So that kind of information. And the last two, how are we going to report and how are we tracking our information? So important document, and again, tailored to your specific project. Most organizations will have a template, and then they'll just kind of tailor it when a new project comes along. Oops. Second thing that is important to have is a good risk register. Risk register are literally also known as risk logs, where we are going to document, identify, analyze, and manage the risk for our project. So at the bottom there, I've just given you kind of high level kind of labels for what A lot of people still use Excel, or there are specific software that you could use to capture this information. So it will often have this basic stuff in there. So a link to our categories so that we can sort. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, show me all the financial risk for your project, you could go financial and give them all of the risks. So a link to categories. The description and consequence or effect, I'm going to talk about that in a second a little bit more. It is really important to spend a little bit more time to make sure that you capture that description really well so that you don't have, for example, weather or bad weather as a risk, because then you need to go back and ask. You need to kind of do a lot more work. Then you have probability, impact, and a score or a risk level is captured. This is usually as easy as based on our matrix values, multiplication of the two factors that gives you the score. Risk modification plan, i.e. risk responses, there's a bunch, there's about 10 of them. By the way, there is more to risk responses than mitigation. So don't call it a mitigation plan. It's more than that. A risk owner is assigned, so who's going to get ownership or who's going to be the person to sound the alarm. And it's not bad to also have, once you've done your controls and you've applied the response, what do you think the level of risk remaining or residual will be? It's not bad to kind of document that. So it gives you an idea. Do we have some more work? Should we look at something else? There's my, I put this information in here. Having a really better definition leads to better understanding. So kind of just be careful. Some people use that if then, if this happened, then method. I find that if you use the three-prong approach, so what is our cause? What's the risk because of that? And what's the impact on the project? If you have that as one nice sentence, people, you don't have to do more work. You don't have to go back to somebody and ask, oh, what did you mean by bad weather? And it makes it easier when it gets to the response point to be able to come up with a response. The matrices don't have time to spend too much time. I've given you some pretty ones in here, but your team and yourself need to really understand inside out what the matrices are about. You also need to make sure that you set these up. I've given you a couple of things to kind of think of when you're setting up your matrices so that you're kind of aware, or you don't kind of come up with kind of things that will make this difficult. But at the end of the day, your matrices are going to be what you build your some of your processes around. A lot of people think that matrices are a waste of time and that you need to go into full quantification. I say no. I say having matrices and having information related to a matrix gives people to get that communication, that discussion around the risk, and that perception of how we see risk, and it's important. By the way, you need to have one for both, so opportunity and threat, and I've kind of given you this one here that is pretty kind of nice and well designed. And again, setting up this as you're setting up your framework is really important. The more people get to know this, the better they'll be at it. Again, another area where we can spend days is get to know your stakeholders' positions on risk. Know if people are really risk averse. They see something and they go boo and they go scurrying, or they risk neutral, like literally like nothing, they don't really matter. I find that people that are fairly risk neutral is because the risk doesn't impact them, but that's my own perspective. And there are some people that are like, give it to me. Like I can take on anything, I can do anything, but there are also consequences. So you need to know your stakeholders' risk tolerance level, their risk appetite. It will have an impact. So when you're gathering the information and you map it out the first time around, if everything is in red, you'll go, whoa, okay. So you need to know this. Unfortunately, you cannot give them a blood test, so there's no questionnaire that will really tell you really accurately what that is. It will really depend on different people's perception different people's experience, financial situation, economic situation. A lot of things goes into this, but it is really important to understand it's going to have an impact on the perception of risk for your project. Lots of tools in the toolbox. I always like to add to my toolbox. So just keep on looking for new tools, new ways to make sure that this work is done and gives you the results that you want. I'm at lessons learned. Look, lessons learned is literally trying to remember things so that we don't go there again. We are not very good as humans to kind of do that. So I'm going to give you a couple of lessons learned that you should kind of keep in mind for your risk management efforts. Lesson learned number one. A lot of these are actually based on my own experience or what some of people have told me. So lesson learned number one, more than likely, the greatest risks that you are going to encounter in your projects are not going to be on your risk register. Wham, I call that the wham factor. So that's kind of from that happens. So, but then what can you learn from that so that you don't have to kind of learn it again? We tend to, and that's sometimes because of our stakeholders' perception or stakeholder biases or stakeholder risk tolerance level, we tend to pay more attention to certain risks than other. And a lot of times, some of these don't even come to fruition, and something else in the background kind of, brings itself to be a monster. So just be careful. Kind of treat like when it's on your risk register, it's on paper. They're all equal. We all need to pay attention to everything and pay attention to it often. The one thing to remember as well is that if there's a risk that happens here, the impact is not just here, it'll be across in different other locations. So learn to literally follow the links there. And that's why understanding the importance of how risk is linked to everything else on your project will save you some of that aggravation. The next one, we need to have a way of managing, and a lot of the time managing means the risk register, which is a list, and people tend to kind of look at the list and just be careful. Again, all of these risks in that risk register need to be handled differently, need to be looked at differently. So just don't go, line by line. Look at it as a whole, look at the connection, try to kind of see what you're doing there. The final lessons learned, spend a little bit more time on having a solid risk identification process, talking to the diverse stakeholders on your project. Literally, we try, and people tell us like, what do you have to spend so much time? Well, spending that time in the planning will give you rewards forward, and that's kind of the whole point of this. So risk identification is really, really key to set yourself up. And also risk responses, having more than one plan sometimes is really important, and that's what makes you proactive. If you have no plan, what's the point in doing it? My final words, and I have this quote on here from one person that I admire, David Elson. If you want to find him on the web, just Google risk doctor. Unfortunately, he's retired, although he's still sort of active, but he's retired. One of his things that he said once was that if a risk happens once, okay, that's understandable. If the same risk happens again, ooh, that's bad luck. If it happens 3 times, that's unacceptable. That's because you're not doing something right when it comes to your risk management. So you and your team should really understand, what are we trying to achieve? You need to understand risk for your particular project. How you go about doing that, try to make things consistent, make things that are reapplicable, so you don't have to recreate the wheel all the time. the whole point of doing risk is to be proactive. Be proactive. Just literally do the risk identification, have responses, monitor, drive action. Don't be scared of the risk, and look at how we can improve things forward. Share that knowledge. So if you've learned a little something today, share it with somebody else. There's always things that can be learned, and don't forget to learn from your own mistakes or your own kind of not doing something good in the first place, or not well, I would say, not necessarily good, but not doing something well. So always kind of learn from that. And always try to make your organization better. Like always try to tweak, change, revisit things. I mean, like after like using the same process over and over again for years, people might just get jaded, get tired, and like say, no. Go and look, what are we getting from this process? How is this getting better for us? Show the way. And I think. Oh, I always have to have the last word. The one thing is, out of all these risk responses, there is not a risk response strategy. That's called ignore. So ignoring risk is really not a strategy that you want to have on any or of your projects. So you, in order to be good at this, you need to put a little bit of work into it, and you need to make things like easier for your stakeholders so that they kind of enjoy the ride and they help you along. And there we go. We're at the question point. Yay.
Hi, Sylvie. Great job.
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions here.
Okay. Oh, cool.
So the first one is from Jamal, and he's
Yeah.
asking, what do most organizations tend to get wrong when doing risk management on projects?
They think complex before thinking simple. So some people will, like right now, will probably have heard the term like enterprise risk management. It's kind of the new big fandango thing. People want to start running before they start walking. So I guess one of the good things is literally like start small, try it out, see what works, see how you can kind of fine tune it. And then as your stakeholders and your teams and people in your organization start thinking in that way, look at improvements and then look at changing it, modifying it. That's where I would think most people want to start with the Cadillac before they start with the bicycle.
Great. And now we have a question from Crystal, who's asking, why are people so afraid of risk?
Well, for most people, if you try this out, you'll see you say the word risk and people will back up. Literally, the word risk causes that reaction in people. And you shouldn't, and that's why I came up with my definition, is that things may or may not happen, right? So just outlining or identifying a risk does not mean that that risk is necessarily going to happen. But in order to be prepared, I've had this discussion, you need to identify it. So it's kind of like a catch-22. I find that if an organization is better as well at understanding opportunities and threats in terms of negative and positive, then that doesn't happen as much. But there are still some people that will tell you that risk, oh my God. Like I remember the first time I told somebody that I was working in risk management, they went like, oh my God, why would you want to do that? It's like so bad. Risk management as a profession is not bad at all. It's actually quite challenging and entertaining, I find, but that's me. So yeah, so a lot of people think of it as negative before they think of it as positive.
And one final question here from Derek. How do opportunities factor in?
Yeah, that's a hard one. People, again, because they tend to think negative out at the front end, it's really difficult for people to think of risk as a positive thing or an opportunity. What I try to teach my student, and start with this, an opportunity will be positive, but it's going to be positive throughout the entire project. So for example, an opportunity cannot be something that happens because something negative has happened. And that's kind of where a lot of people sometimes go to with opportunity. An opportunity is something totally positive that you can augment the impact or the probability of happening, which will end up benefiting in some way. So for example, because you were able to find a local supplier of something, the cost of shipping is going to be reduced as opposed to somebody that's far off and what that kind of stuff. As opposed to somebody, for example, well, because we fired 50 people, we're going to end up with more money. That's not an opportunity. I would think that those 50 people would not like that very much. So when you think of an opportunity, think of an opportunity as something always positive that you want to take advantage of, or you want to tilt in your direction. And again, when you start doing that and you start thinking that way in your organization, you will see that people will think that there's way more value that comes out of your risk management process than what they saw before. Does that answer the question? I hope so.
I think so. I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank Sylvie again for a wonderful presentation and thank everyone for spending their lunch hour with us. If you'd like more information on today's topic, please contact sales@procept.com or 1-800-261-6861. And another reminder that today's webinar is part of our monthly series. You can find information about upcoming webinars wherever you found this one. Have a great day, everyone.